Tonight, we begin with a development that has quietly shaken the foundations of global security. This morning, a phrase many believed belonged only to history books began circulating again in serious conversations. World War II was not spoken publicly, but it was present behind closed doors in intelligence briefings, classified summaries, and urgent calls that never reached the press. Something happened that forced NATO to respond in a way it has deliberately avoided for years. And once you understand what that response signals, it becomes clear this is not just another news cycle. Bennett, here is the key point. This situation did not originate in Ukraine. It began far from the front lines, in a space where movement matters more than firepower, and where silence carries more weight than threats. Toward the end of last week, Russian military planners authorized a decision that appeared routine to anyone not watching closely. There were no explosions, no satellite images splashed across headlines, no emergency broadcasts, just a quiet relocation. A subtle repositioning of assets that are not meant for battlefield combat. These are not weapons designed to confront soldiers. These are systems that unsettle governments, and NATO detected the shift almost immediately. Within hours, the alliance recognized what was happening. That alone tells us how grave the situation is, because NATO does not move unless the intelligence is both credible and alarming. Bond, what followed should have raised every alarm. Emergency consultations began simultaneously across allied capitals. Defense ministers were called into unscheduled meetings. Command structures quietly adjusted their alert postures. Contingency plans, normally buried deep within classified protocols, were reviewed and refined. None of this was announced. None of it was explained, but it happened, and the silence surrounding it is not accidental. Aircraft with no operational reason to relocate were suddenly repositioned. Naval patrol routes shifted. Standby forces were placed into higher readiness. This was not a drill. This was not symbolic. This was preparation. And preparation only happens when leadership believes a risk has crossed a critical threshold. This is where public understanding often goes wrong. Escalation does not begin with open aggression. It begins with assumptions. Russia assumed NATO would interpret this movement as routine. NATO assumed the movement was intentional. The moment both sides abandoned the assumption of good faith, the entire equation changed. From that point on, every action became a potential threat. What Russia did was not illegal. It violated no treaties. It was not without precedent, but it was provocative. And provocation does not require rule breaking to be dangerous. It only needs to test patience. This is why analysts are uneasy. Moscow was not testing territory. It was testing reaction time. How fast would NATO detect the move? How quickly would it coordinate internally? Would the alliance hesitate? That answer came faster than expected, and that speed may not have been anticipated in Moscow. NATO did not debate publicly. It did not leak to the press. It acted quietly, collectively, and decisively. When an alliance moves without speaking, it means the real discussions have already taken place behind closed doors. This is not calm. It is preparation. Now, let me explain why this moment feels fundamentally different. This is no longer about the borders of Ukraine. It is about proximity. Russian military assets have moved closer to areas that NATO considers strategically critical, not symbolic locations, not political lines on a map. These are zones where military response times are extremely short, where errors multiply quickly, and where a single misstep can cascade into something uncontrollable. NATO's reaction reflects an awareness of that danger. By repositioning its own forces, the alliance has effectively reduced its decision-making window. On the surface, this looks defensive. In reality, it introduces a serious risk. Shorter timelines leave less space for diplomacy. And once forces are deployed forward, pulling them back becomes politically costly. Retreat begins to look like weakness. And that perception itself becomes a threat. Behind the scenes, communication channels have intensified, but not the kind the public usually hears about. This is not open diplomacy. These are quiet military-to-military contacts. And the most unsettling part is their purpose. They are not being used to negotiate outcomes. They exist to prevent accidents. Think carefully about what that implies. When the primary objective becomes do not misunderstand us, it means both sides now believe misunderstanding is not just possible, but likely. That is how fragile the situation has become. This explains the change in official language. Fewer threats, less dramatic rhetoric, more carefully chosen words. This is not de-escalation. It is caution under pressure. Confident leaders speak boldly. Nervous leaders measure every sentence as if it could trigger something irreversible. Right now, everything feels irreversible. History is full of moments where leaders believed they still had control, right up until they didn't. Wars do not begin with declarations. They begin with movements that become too costly to reverse and assumptions that cannot be undone. This is why analysts are once again whispering the unthinkable. Not because war is inevitable, but because the safeguards designed to prevent it are under strain. The most dangerous element of this moment is not what Russia has already done. It is what Moscow expects to happen next. Russia believes NATO is slow, divided, vulnerable to internal disagreement. Belief is not random. It has been shaped by years of watching disputes, delays, and political fractures within the alliance. So when Moscow made its latest move, the calculation was not reckless. It expected debate. It expected hesitation. It expected diplomatic noise. What it did not expect was speed, and speed is destabilizing. When a response arrives faster than anticipated, it forces immediate reassessment. That is exactly what occurred within NATO. There was a moment that mattered more than any public statement, a moment when the alliance had to decide whether Russia's action was symbolic or preparatory. That decision was made in secure rooms filled with maps, timelines, and worst-case scenarios laid out in uncomfortable detail. NATO chose to assume intent rather than ambiguity, and that choice dramatically raised the stakes. Because assuming intent means planning for outcomes no one wants to name. But once those questions are asked, there is no returning to comfort. The objective of NATO's response was simple on the surface: eliminate doubt, demonstrate awareness. Make it clear that hesitation was not part of the equation, but deterrence has two sides. When doubt disappears on one side, it can generate panic on the other. And in Russian military doctrine, perception matters deeply. How actions are interpreted, how resolve is measured, how quickly an adversary reacts. A faster than expected NATO response may have sent a message Moscow did not anticipate. Not weakness, but readiness. And readiness creates a dilemma. Do you pause and reassess, or do you push further to avoid appearing constrained? That dilemma is unfolding right now. This explains why military traffic has increased, why command chains have tightened, why decision timelines have shortened. Everyone is waiting for the next signal, and that signal does not need to be dramatic. It could be small, a patrol extending slightly beyond its usual route, an exercise scheduled at the wrong moment, an aircraft flying closer than normal. In a highly tense environment, small actions gain outsized meaning. But this is also why NATO's current unity carries an unexpected danger. Unity prevents confusion, but it also removes buffers. When disagreement exists, action slows. When unity is firm, action accelerates. Now add another layer: internal pressure on both sides. President Putin cannot afford to appear passive. Reversing course after initiating a move raises questions at home and abroad. The same logic applies to NATO. Once readiness is declared, stepping back becomes politically difficult. The escalation becomes a communication challenge. How do you slow down without signaling retreat? This is why diplomatic channels are under strain. They are not negotiating peace. They are negotiating space. Space to slow momentum, space to reduce misunderstanding, space to keep events from accelerating beyond control. Because in this environment, momentum itself is the enemy. When events begin feeding off one another, leadership loses control. And control is already weaker than it appears. Modern military systems do not wait the way they once did. Automated defenses, rapid response protocols, standing orders designed for speed. Speed saves lives until it removes time for reasoning. Dumb DSA misinterpreted signal can trigger a response before explanation is possible, and once that response occurs, it creates its own logic. Retaliation, demonstration, escalation. This is how crises grow beyond original intent. But there is another factor that makes this moment especially dangerous. It is unfolding during a period of global distraction. Multiple conflicts, economic pressure, political transitions, all of this creates opportunity and risk. When attention is divided, coordination weakens. And coordination is what keeps red lines from being crossed accidentally. This is why senior officials are cautious. They understand that global stability is not preserved by confidence alone. It is maintained through constant, exhausting restraint. And restraint becomes harder to sustain when both sides believe they are acting defensively. Russia views NATO movements as encroachment. NATO views Russian movements as provocation. Both believe they are responding, not initiating. And when everyone believes they are reacting, escalation has no owner. When no one feels responsible, no one feels obligated to stop. So where does that leave us in a moment where escalation no longer requires a decision from presidents or generals? It can be triggered by systems, by protocols, by timelines already set in motion. This is why analysts are no longer asking whether leaders want war. They are asking whether leaders can still control events, and that answer is becoming less certain with each passing hour. The situation is crowded now. Forces are forward deployed. Signals are being exchanged. Assumptions are hardening. Nothing has exploded. But the atmosphere is volatile, and volatility does not require intent. It only requires friction. There is a scenario military planners almost never discuss publicly. Not because it is far-fetched, but because acknowledging it makes it harder to avoid. This scenario does not begin with a massive strike. It does not involve a deliberate decision to start a global war. It begins with friction. Friction between systems operating under extreme stress. Friction between compressed timelines that no longer allow patience. Friction between assumptions made in seconds that take days to correct. This is the scenario keeping commanders awake at night. Picture it carefully. Forces on both sides are positioned forward. Response times are shortened. Standing orders are active. Then something small occurs, not dramatic, not cinematic. An aircraft moves slightly closer than intended. A radar system misclassifies a signal. A naval patrol misjudges distance. None of these incidents are unusual. What is new is the environment in which they occur. High alert, compressed decision windows, zero tolerance for hesitation. A defensive system activates not because escalation is desired, but because it is programmed to respond. Once that response occurs, it demands interpretation. Was it deliberate? Was it a warning? Was it an error? The problem is that interpretation takes time, and time is exactly what no one has. So the next move happens before clarity arrives, and what began as a misunderstanding becomes a sequence with its own momentum. This is why senior officials fear chain reactions more than hostile intent. Chain reactions do not require villains. They do not require conscious decisions. They only require motion. This is the nightmare scenario, not war by choice, war by momentum. Once momentum takes hold, stopping it requires something almost no leader wants to do: back down publicly. Because backing down under pressure carries its own risks. It invites questions, it signals vulnerability, it tempts further tests. So leaders hesitate, they respond proportionally, they mirror each other's actions. They wait for the other side to stop first. And that waiting allows escalation to continue. Now add one final element that makes this moment uniquely dangerous. Communication delays, not technical delays, but political ones. Every message is now scrutinized, rewritten, filtered through multiple layers of approval. Each layer adds time. Each delay widens the gap between action and explanation. By the time clarity arrives, events may already be moving on their own. Bound. This is why modern crises frighten strategists more than past wars. Not only because weapons are more destructive, but because decisions now move faster than understanding. And understanding is what prevents catastrophe. At this moment, both sides believe they are acting responsibly. Russia believes it is defending its interests. NATO believes it is protecting its members. Both positions are internally logical. And that is exactly what makes the situation so dangerous. When responsibility is shared, restraint becomes optional. Each side assumes the other will be the one to pause. History shows how this ends. Man, here is the part you want to say out loud. Once forces are fully engaged, even de-escalation becomes risky. Pulling back may expose weakness. Pausing may invite exploitation. Doing nothing may be interpreted as preparation for something worse. Every option carries danger. That is why official language sounds so controlled, so measured, so cautious. This is not confidence. It is fear of miscalculation, and fear spreads. It moves through command structures, governments, and alliances. It suppresses anger, but it hardens assumptions. The line between peace and conflict becomes so thin, it nearly disappears. So are we at the end of the road? Not in any dramatic sense. There are no countdown clocks. No declarations of war, no missiles on launch pads, but in a quieter, more serious way, yes. We have reached a point where preventing escalation requires active restraint, not passive hope. Every move must be calibrated. Every signal double-checked, every assumption challenged, and sustaining this level of discipline over time is extraordinarily difficult, especially under domestic pressure, especially with political consequences, especially with history watching. The table is set, the room is tense. The players are cautious but determined. What happens next does not depend on who wants what. It depends on who can slow momentum first, and that is the hardest test of leadership. Because the moment you slow down, you risk being the only one to do so. And in a world this tense, standing still can feel more dangerous than moving forward. Think of it this way. On a crowded highway, slowing down can feel more dangerous than maintaining speed. That is the paradox facing leaders right now. Not because global war is inevitable, but because the systems built to prevent it are under extreme strain. And strained systems often fail quietly before they fail catastrophically. The world is not waiting for an announcement. It is waiting for the next signal. And whether that signal calms the room or pushes it closer to a point of no return depends entirely on decisions being made right now. Decisions made in rooms we cannot see, by people whose names we may never know, under pressure that is difficult to fully comprehend. Bali ambulaire, that uncertainty is what should concern anyone paying attention. The next chapter will not be written by those who want conflict. It will be written by those who believe they have no alternative but to act. And when action feels like the only option, standing still becomes nearly impossible. Baliant, both NATO and Russian command structures are now operating in what military psychologists describe as a high-threat perception state. Every piece of information is filtered through suspicion. Every silence is interpreted as potential deception. Russian commanders see NATO's defensive preparations and perceive offensive intent. NATO commanders observe Russian movements and see preparations for aggression. Neither side is necessarily wrong in what they observe, but neither is necessarily right in how they interpret it, and those interpretations shape the next decisions. This creates a feedback loop. Each defensive step validates the other side's fear, which justifies further defensive measures, reinforcing even greater fear. And history offers a warning. During the July crisis of İçin Jolbite İsur Sus, similar dynamics unfolded over a matter of weeks. What began as a regional dispute escalated into global catastrophe, not because leaders sought war, but because each believed retaliation. Once mobilization plans were activated, stopping them became politically and militarily impossible without appearing weak. And we are not living in İçin Jolbite İsur Sus, but the psychological mechanisms are disturbingly familiar. Modern technology has accelerated everything except wisdom. We can detect threats faster, communicate faster, mobilize faster, but we cannot think faster. We cannot overcome cognitive bias faster. And the speed of modern systems often reduces the space for reflection and alternative interpretation. There is another layer that heightens the danger. The international system is undergoing what scholars call a hegemonic transition. Periods where power balances shift have historically been among the most unstable. Established powers fear decline. Rising powers resist constraint. In such moments, compromise is easily mistaken for surrender. This is the environment we are in now. One where small miscalculations can have outsized consequences. The real question is not whether leaders want to avoid war. Of course they do. The question is whether the systems they rely on, the assumptions they hold, and the momentum already in motion have made conflict more likely than restraint. Before we learn the answer the hard way, we must ask whether anyone still has the resolve, the judgment, and the courage to step back. We may find out in the coming days. That's all for today. Good.